Oak. Out in the high desert country of the New Mexico Territory, three hardened ranchers, each sent away for a bride. They expected three strangers. What the southbound stage delivered was three sisters bound by blood, by grief, and by a secret dangerous enough to get them all killed. Oak. The summer of 1887 had been merciless in the Sangre de Cristo foothills. The kind of heat that cracked the red earth into puzzle pieces and drove rattlesnakes into the shade of the porch steps. The Hargrove brothers had weathered it the same way they weathered everything, through the grinding machinery of routine and a stubborn refusal to admit they needed anything at all. Oak. Holt Hargrove, the eldest, ran the largest cattle operation in Colfax County. He was 41 years old, sun-darkened and iron-tempered, the kind of man who spoke in short declarative sentences and meant every one of them. His younger brother, Cassian, was a former Army scout, lean and watchful, with eyes that never quite settled on one thing for too long. The youngest, Fletcher, had built his own small horse ranch on the adjacent parcel, a thoughtful, deliberate man who read by lamplight until the oil ran out and woke before dawn to be alone with the silence. Three separate ranches, three separate lives, one shared stubborn loneliness that none of them had ever named aloud. It was Holt who sent the letters. He didn't consult his brothers first. He simply rode into the town of Cimarron on a Tuesday morning, walked into the territorial post office, and mailed 3 sealed envelopes to the Sterling Hart's Matrimonial Bureau in St. Louis, Missouri, one for each of them. Over a dinner of beans and salt pork that evening, he laid it out without ceremony. He told Cassian and Fletcher what he had done. Cassian stared at him for a long moment and then went back to eating. Fletcher set down his fork, thought about it, and nodded once. That was as close to an enthusiastic agreement as the Hargrove brothers ever came. The profiles Holt had submitted were as different as the men themselves. For himself, he had requested a woman of practical temperament, someone unafraid of hard work and unmoved by the rough edges of frontier life. Cassian had asked for a woman of quiet nerve, not timid but settled, the kind who didn't rattle easily. Fletcher's request had been the most specific. He wanted someone who read. He'd written it plainly in his letter. A woman who finds the world in books and isn't embarrassed by it. The Bureau's reply arrived 6 weeks later. 3 matches had been secured. A widow named Harriet Cross from St. Louis, a former school teacher named Frances Dolan from Memphis, and a young woman named Adelaide Vane from an unspecified address in the Tennessee Hill Country. All 3 were confirmed on the same southbound stage, arriving the 3rd Friday of August. On the appointed day, all 3 Hargrove brothers rode into Cimarron together. The town turned to look at them. That was nothing new. 3 large, armed, weathered men arriving in formation tended to draw attention. They tied their horses at the rail outside the stage depot and waited in the full hammer of the afternoon sun without complaint. The stage arrived 20 minutes late, which set Holt's jaw in a hard line. The door swung open. The first woman down was tall, composed to the point of severity, her dark brown hair pinned beneath a traveling hat the color of dried tobacco. She wore the controlled expression of someone who had prepared extensively for whatever was about to happen. This, presumably, was Harriet Cross, the widow. She turned and offered her hand back up into the carriage. The second woman descended with considerably less composure. She was shorter, round-faced, with a quick, assessing gaze that moved over the 3 Hargrove brothers and the dusty New Mexico street behind them with undisguised alarm. She had the same dark brown hair, worn in a looser arrangement, and the same unusual hazel eyes, a pale amber green that caught the sun like shallow creek water. Frances Dolan, the schoolteacher. Cassian's hand stilled on the pommel of his saddle. The third woman was last. She did not climb down so much as she was helped down by her eldest sister's steady grip. She was the smallest of the 3, perhaps 20 years old, with a thin frame that suggested either a recent illness or a long period of inadequate meals. She clutched a battered leather satchel against her chest with both arms. She had the same brown hair, the same hazel eyes, but hers were shadowed with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with the journey. The 3 women stood shoulder to shoulder in the street. The resemblance between them was not subtle. It was the kind of resemblance that stopped conversation. Holt stepped forward off the boardwalk. He was not a man who required much time to process what he was looking at. Your sisters, he said. It was not a question. The tallest woman met his gaze without flinching. We are. My name is Rosalind Fenn. These are my sisters, Beatrice and Addie. She paused, reading his expression with careful precision. I am aware this is not what the Bureau arranged. Oak. No, Holt agreed, his voice dangerously even. It is not. Oak. Cassian had dismounted. He stood a few feet back, watching Beatrice, who was watching him right back with a look that was equal parts wariness and something she was clearly trying to suppress. Fletcher had not moved from his horse. He was looking at the youngest one, at the battered satchel she held like something sacred, at the way her knuckles had gone white. Oak. So the Bureau matched all three of us, Cassian said slowly, to three women who were already traveling together. Oak. We arranged it that way, Rosalind said. We paid an additional sum to ensure our applications reached the same destination. The Bureau's matchmaker believed she was placing three separate women. She was not wrong about our circumstances, only our connection to one another. Oak. You lied, Holt said. Oak. We survived, Rosalind replied, and the two words carried a weight that pressed the air flat between them. Oak. Addie, the youngest, flinched at something, not at anything anyone had said, but at the sound of a horse shifting suddenly down the street. Her eyes cut to the sound and didn't return to center for a long moment. Oak. Holt looked at his brothers. Fletcher had finally dismounted. He walked to Addie's side of the wagon without being asked, and quietly lifted her trunk from the roof, setting it in the bed of the wagon he'd brought without making any particular show of the gesture. Oak. Holt turned back to Rosalind. The ride to my ranch takes 2 hours. We'll talk when we get there. He said nothing more and walked to the wagon seat. Oak. Rosalind looked at the space he had left behind him. Then she picked up her own trunk handle and said to her sisters, in a voice pitched low enough that only they could hear, It's all right, come on. Oak. The ride into the foothills was tense in the particular way that comes from too many unanswered questions occupying the same small space. The desert rolled past in shades of rust and amber, the scrub juniper casting thin blue shadows in the late afternoon light. Holt drove the wagon and said nothing. Rosalind sat beside him on the bench and also said nothing, though the silence between them was of a different texture than his. His was habitual, hers was deliberate. Oak. Behind them, Cassian rode his gray horse close to the wagon's right side, near where Beatrice sat. She had been watching the landscape with the focused intensity of someone cataloging escape routes. Once the horse stumbled on a loose rock and crowded the wagon, and Cassian's hand shot out instinctively to brace the vehicle's side rail, bringing him within a foot of her. She did not startle. She looked at his hand, then at his face, with an expression he couldn't immediately categorize. Oak. Former Army, she asked. Oak. Scout, 6 years. Oak. I thought so. She went back to watching the landscape. After a moment, she added quietly, You're the one checking the ridgeline. Oak. Cassian said nothing, but he was. Oak. Fletcher rode on the other side of the wagon, keeping pace with where Addie sat hunched in the wagon bed, her satchel still in her lap. The afternoon heat was brutal and her thin jacket was entirely wrong for it, but she hadn't removed it. After a mile or so, Fletcher unhooked his canteen from his saddle and held it out toward her without comment. Oak. She looked at it, then at him, then took it. She drank carefully, not greedily, like someone who had learned to be measured about things given freely. She handed it back and said, barely audible, over the creak of the wagon, Thank you, Mr. Hargrove. Oak. Fletcher's fine, he said. Oak. She didn't offer her name in return. He didn't ask for it. Oak. Holt's ranch announced itself first as a sound, the low of cattle somewhere over the ridge, and then as a smell of water, the mineral green scent of the irrigation ditch that ran along the eastern pasture. The main house was built from adobe and timber, thick-walled against the heat, with a deep covered porch running its full length. It was not a gentle place, but it was solid, the kind of structure built by someone who intended to stay. Oak. The sisters gathered on the porch while the brothers unloaded the trunks. The reality of where they were settled visibly over them, the vast empty sky, the enormous silence, the distance from everything familiar. Beatrice stood with her arms crossed, scanning. Addie sat on the porch step and put her satchel carefully between her feet. Rosalind counted the outbuildings and the sight lines and said nothing. Oak. Dinner was a quiet, careful affair. A meal of beef stew and cornbread that Holt had prepared that morning, which surprised Rosalind enough that she glanced at him twice before she could stop herself. Afterward, when Cassian took Beatrice, and Fletcher took Addie to see the spare rooms, Holt told Rosalind to stay. Oak. The kitchen felt smaller with just the two of them in it. He sat across the table from her and set his hands flat on the wood between them. The kerosene lamp threw its orange light across the hard angles of his face. "Oak. I'm not a patient man," he said, "and I'm not a fool. You didn't forge your way out to the New Mexico territory and bribe a matchmaker to stay together because you were feeling sentimental. So tell me what you brought to my door." "Oak." Rosalind had spent the last 3 weeks constructing and discarding versions of this conversation. She had imagined a dozen different men asking this question, and a dozen different ways to deflect it. But looking at Holt Hargrove in his own kitchen, she found that she was too tired to deflect anything. "Oak. His name is Harlan Stroud," she said. "Oak." Holt's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened in a way that told her the name meant something. "Oak. Our father was Edmund Fenn," she continued, her voice steady by sheer force of will. "He was a land agent in Nashville, a good man who kept meticulous records of everything he witnessed in 30 years of brokering property in the Tennessee counties. 2 years ago, he discovered that Harlan Stroud had been systematically defrauding land claims across 4 counties, filing false ownership documents, displacing farming families, bribing county clerks. My father gathered the evidence. Oak. He intended to bring it to the federal land office. Oak. She stopped. The fire in the small stove popped and settled. Oak. He never made it, Holt said. Oak. He was found dead at the bottom of the Shelby Creek embankment. The coroner said it was an accident. He'd apparently lost control of his buggy on the old mountain road. My father drove that road every week for 20 years. Rosalind looked at the lamp flame. The night before he died, he came home late. He gave me a package wrapped in brown paper and told me to hide it somewhere. Stroud's men would never think to look. He said he would explain everything in the morning. Oak. But there was no morning, Holt said. Oak. There was no morning, she agreed. 2 days after his burial, men arrived at our house. They took everything. His files, his correspondence, his office records. They were polite about it. They had paperwork. She looked up at Holt. Harlan Stroud sits on the Territorial Bank Board in Nashville. He has friends in the federal land office. He practically drafts the legislation himself. Oak. What was in the package? Oak. Rosalind reached into the pocket of her skirt and set a small iron key on the table between them. Oak. Everything my father documented. Property deeds, false filings, names of the clerks he bribed, a ledger of payments going back 8 years. He'd hidden copies of everything in a strong box at his attorney's office. The key opens it. Oak. Holt stared at the key for a moment. Oak. But the attorney, she said, is also dead. Stroud's men have been one step behind us since the night we left Nashville. We traveled under different names and took the long route through Kentucky and Missouri. We were careful. She folded her hands on the table. I am telling you this because you asked, and because you deserve to know what kind of trouble walked into your house tonight. If you want to put us on the morning stage back to Cimarron, I understand it. Oak. Holt sat with this for a long moment. He was a man who had spent 41 years making decisions about land, about cattle, about weather and water and men with bad intentions. He was not a man who flinched at complexity. Oak. He picked up the key and held it in his palm, then set it back down in front of her. Oak. This is my land, he said. Nobody comes onto it and takes what they're not entitled to take. He stood, pushing his chair back. You sleep in a real bed tonight, Rosalind. We'll sort the rest in the morning. Oak. The weeks that followed stitched themselves into a strange new shape. Stroud's shadow hung over the ranch like a weather system coming from the east, but the days themselves had an odd, dissonant domesticity. Holt drilled new watch rotations with his ranch hands and spent his evenings teaching Rosalind to shoot a Winchester carbine. Oak. She proved to be a faster study than he'd expected, which he told her in exactly those words, which she received with a brief, dry smile that reached her eyes before she could take it back. Oak. A different kind of rearrangement was happening in the spaces between the main house and the 2 smaller ranch buildings. Beatrice had taken over the bookkeeping of Cassian's small operation without being asked, having discovered that his ledger entries were 3 months behind and hopelessly tangled. Oak. She set up a small desk by his window and worked in the mornings while he was out on the range, and when he came back in the evenings, she would ask him pointed, specific questions about his inventory figures that made him realize she had absorbed more about his operation in a week than most people managed in a season. Oak. One evening he found her on the porch, scanning the north ridge with his field glasses. Oak. You're looking for riders, he said. Oak. You were checking the ridgeline 2 minutes ago, she replied, not lowering the glasses. I thought I'd help. Oak. He sat down beside her on the porch steps. What do they look like, the men Stroud sends? Oak. She was quiet for a moment. In Nashville, they wore good coats. Out here, I imagine they'll look like everyone else. That's what worries me. Oak. Cassian took that information and filed it exactly where it belonged. From that evening forward, he taught her what to look for. A horse that moved wrong. A silhouette that paused too long on a ridge, the particular way dust behaved when more than 2 riders stirred it. She was an excellent student. Alert, precise, unafraid. Oak. The transformation happening around Fletcher and Addie was quieter, and perhaps, for that reason, more complete. Addie had finally told him her full name, Adelaide, which she said she'd always found too large for herself. She'd been sick the previous winter, she explained simply, which accounted for the hollowed look of her. She was recovering. Oak. She'd brought the satchel. She showed him this willingly, without being pressed, because it contained her father's personal diary, the one document Stroud's men had never located, which detailed everything Edmund Fenn had witnessed and recorded over 3 decades. Oak. Fletcher handled the diary with the careful attention he gave to old books. He read several entries she indicated, and said very little, which she had already come to understand was not the same as having nothing to say. Oak. He began to leave things for her at breakfast. Small wildflowers pressed in a square of cloth, a smooth piece of red sandstone from the creek bed, a slim volume of Tennyson she'd mentioned in passing. Addie put each of these things in a row on the windowsill above her bed. She did not explain to her sisters why she was suddenly sleeping better than she had in 8 months. Oak. The warning came on a Wednesday morning. Oak. The ranch dogs began their alarm before anyone saw anything, a low, sustained growl from the ones near the gate that had a different register than their usual noise. Fletcher heard it from the barn and came out with his rifle already in hand. Oak. Riding up the main trail was a man who looked, from a distance, like a routine traveler. He was alone, riding a good horse, wearing a canvas duster that was too new for this kind of country. He stopped 50 yards from the gate. Oak. I'm looking for Holt Hargrove, he called. Oak. Holt came off the porch. You found him. Oak. The man reached slowly into his coat and produced a document. I've got a civil process here from the Federal Land Office in Santa Fe, pertaining to one Rosalind Fenn, formerly of Nashville, Tennessee, and 2 associates, wanted in connection with the theft of property records and the obstruction of a legitimate federal investigation. He had a flat, professional smile. I'm authorized to take them into federal custody for transport back east. Oak. Rosalind appeared in the doorway behind Holt. She had her carbine. Oak. Who authorized the warrant? Holt said. Oak. The Federal Land Office, the man repeated. Oak. Under whose signature? Oak. The man's professional smile held. Commissioner Aldous Price, acting on a complaint filed by the Stroud Land and Banking Corporation of Nashville, Tennessee. Oak. Holt took the document, read it with the unhurried patience of a man who has reviewed a great deal of paperwork in his life, and handed it back. Oak. This warrant, he said carefully, is signed by a commissioner who accepted a bribe from Harlan Stroud in June of 1885. The payment is documented. I suggest you ride back to Cimarron and telegraph your employer that the women you're looking for are under the protection of this ranch, and that the next men who come up this trail with false federal paper will be sent back tied across their saddles. Oak. The rider's smile faded by careful degrees. He looked past Holt to the 3 Hargrove brothers and the 2 women visible in doorways. He looked at the ranch hands positioned at various points of the property. He tucked the warrant back inside his duster. Oak. Mr. Stroud isn't a patient man, he said. Oak. Neither am I, Holt replied. Ride. Oak. The man rode. Oak. But he did not ride far enough. 3 nights later they came in number. Oak. Rosalind woke to the sound of the dogs in full alarm at 20 minutes past midnight. She was out of bed and had her carbine from the wall before she was fully awake, a fact she noted with a distant, strange pride. She could hear movement in the main room, Holt's boots on the floorboards, the metallic slide of a lever action being worked. Oak. She came out to find him at the front window, his Winchester pressed to his cheek, scanning the dark yard. Oak. 6 riders, he said without turning, maybe more in the tree line. They cut the fence on the east pasture to spook the cattle. They wanted the noise to cover their approach. Oak. It didn't work, she said. Oak. No, he agreed, it did not. Oak. The attack came from two directions simultaneously. 3 men at the front gate and at least 3 more coming around the south end of the barn, trying to flank the house. The first shots cracked the night open like an axe through dry wood. Rosalind fired through the front window at a muzzle flash and heard a man shout from the direction of the gate. Oak. In the barn, Cassian and Beatrice had taken position behind the heavy timber walls. Beatrice reloaded while Cassian shot, the two of them working in a rhythm that had developed over 3 weeks of drills with a natural efficiency that surprised them both. One of Stroud's men tried to reach the barn door. He didn't make it. Oak. At the far end of the property, Fletcher had moved Addie into the root cellar the moment the dogs started. She had gone without argument, but she had pressed her father's diary into his hands before she descended the steps, and she looked him in the eyes when she did it. Oak. Don't lose that, she said. Oak. I won't, he said. Oak. He closed the cellar door and took his position at the corner of the small house, his rifle covering the south approach. Oak. The fight lasted 11 minutes. It felt longer. When the last of Stroud's men broke and ran, 3 of them, leaving 2 of their number down in the dust, and 1 more nursing a broken shoulder by the fence line, the silence that returned was the absolute, ringing kind that only comes after violence. Oak. Holt stood on the porch in the dark, reloading methodically. Rosalind came out beside him. Her hands were entirely steady. Oak. They'll report back, she said. Oak. I know. Oak. Stroud won't send riders next time. He'll use the federal machinery, warrants, marshals, legal process. She looked at Holt in the thin pre-dawn light. The only way to stop this is to make the documents public before he can bury them. Oak. Holt looked at the key she still wore on a cord around her neck. The strong box is in Nashville. Oak. The attorney's widow still holds it. She wrote to Rosalind, to me, 2 weeks before we left. She said she would keep it until I came for it. Rosalind hesitated. But Stroud has the Nashville courts entirely sewn up. Filing anything there is handing it directly back to him. Oak. Holt turned this over. The Federal Circuit Court in Denver is outside Stroud's reach. Judge Emmeline Rourke. She was appointed directly by the Attorney General last year. She's been dismantling fraudulent land claims across the territory for 18 months. Oak. Rosalind stared at him. Oak. I read the papers, Holt said. Oak. She looked away over the dark pasture, and something that had been wound very tight in her chest for a very long time shifted and loosened. We'd need the strongbox, she said. Oak. I have 2 ranch hands I trust with my life. One of them has a sister in Memphis who can get to Nashville quietly. He said it the way he said most things, as though the problem were simply one of logistics, waiting to be solved. We send for the box. When it arrives, we ride to Denver. Oak. That's a long ride. Oak. You can shoot on horseback now, he said. I checked. Oak. She almost smiled. She was very close to it. Oak. The strongbox arrived 11 days later, carried in a flour sack by a young woman who had made the journey from Nashville to New Mexico in 8 days by not sleeping more than necessary. She handed it to Holt at the gate, accepted a meal and a bed for one night, and departed before sunrise. Oak. The box contained exactly what Edmund Fenn had promised. 8 years of documented fraud. 53 falsified land filings across 4 Tennessee counties. A detailed accounting of payments to 9 county clerks, 2 state officials, and 1 federal land commissioner. Correspondence, in Stroud's own hand, directing the obstruction of a legitimate investigation. Oak. And at the very bottom of the box, wrapped in oilskin, a signed statement from a former Stroud clerk who had witnessed the falsification of records directly. Oak. Emmett, the ranch hand, built a false compartment into the bed of the supply wagon. The documents went in, then a half-inch of timber, then 60 pounds of flour on top of that. Rosalind wore the key on its cord. The diary stayed in Fletcher's coat pocket. Oak. They left for Denver on a Tuesday, the Hargrove brothers and the Fenn sisters, traveling as a group that looked, to anyone watching the road, like a ranch family making a supply run. Beatrice had argued successfully that 6 armed people were harder to ambush than 3, and that she could handle a rifle as well as any of the hands. This was true. Cassian had seen to that over the preceding 3 weeks, with a thoroughness that had surprised and quietly impressed her. Oak. The road to Denver was 4 days. Nothing happened on the first 2. On the morning of the 3rd, Cassian spotted a rider on the eastern ridge who stayed parallel with them for 2 hours without closing the distance. Holt pulled the wagon off the trail at a creek crossing, and they ate their noon meal in a position where the wagon formed a natural barrier, and the ridge was covered from 3 angles. Oak. The rider did not approach. Oak. He also did not leave. Oak. As the afternoon lengthened and the rider remained visible on the ridge, Beatrice said quietly to Cassian, "He's waiting for someone to meet him." Oak. Cassian had already thought of this. He had also already identified the most likely intercept point, a narrow defile 3 miles up the trail where the road curved between 2 rock faces. "If they mean to take us," he said, "it'll be there." Oak. Holt made the decision without discussion. They left the wagon at the creek crossing with one ranch hand to watch it, and went through the defile on horseback, spread wide and fast, covering each other across the open ground. There were 2 men waiting in the rocks. They had the high ground. They also had the disadvantage of 6 people who had spent the previous 2 weeks doing nothing but thinking about exactly this kind of moment. Oak. It was over quickly. No one was killed. One of Stroud's men had a broken collarbone and considerable incentive to find another line of employment. The other surrendered without much deliberation. Oak. They rode into Denver on a Friday afternoon. Oak. Judge Emmeline Rourke received them in her chambers that same evening, which told Holt something about the state of the territory that he'd already suspected. The honest officials were working long hours because there weren't enough of them. She was a small woman with iron gray hair and the particular stillness of someone who had learned to be very still in rooms full of loud men. She read every document in the strongbox. She asked Rosalind 4 precise questions. Oak. She asked Addie 1 question about the diary, which Addie answered with quiet, exhausted clarity. Oak. Then Judge Rourke closed the strongbox and set her hands flat on it. Oak. "I'm issuing federal arrest warrants tonight," she said, "for Harlan Stroud, Commissioner Aldous Price, and 9 county officers in Tennessee." She looked at Rosalind. "Your father was a thorough man." Oak. "He was," Rosalind said, and her voice broke on it just the once. Oak. "The warrants moved faster than Stroud's money, which is the thing about a judiciary that hasn't been bought. It tends to be efficient." Federal marshals reached Stroud's Nashville estate within 48 hours of the warrants being issued. He was taken while breakfasting, which was later reported with some satisfaction by the Nashville papers. Oak. The Tennessee land fraud case was tried in federal court over the following winter. The testimony of Edmund Fenn's records, the diary, and the former clerk's signed statement was, according to the prosecuting attorney, the most comprehensively documented case of systematic land fraud he had seen in 20 years of practice. 53 families had their land titles restored. Commissioner Price was disbarred and imprisoned. Oak. 8 of the 9 county clerks accepted plea arrangements and testified against the man who had paid them. Oak. Harlan Stroud was convicted on 11 counts of fraud, 2 counts of obstruction, and 1 count of conspiracy in connection with the death of a Nashville attorney. He would not see the outside of a federal penitentiary for a very long time. Oak. Back in the Sangre de Cristo foothills, the autumn came in cooler than usual, which the ranchers said was a good sign for the winter grass. The Hargrove properties settled back into their rhythms, but the rhythms had changed in ways that were quiet and permanent. There were more horses in the paddocks. There were books on shelves that hadn't had books before. Oak. There was a lamp burning late in Cassian's bunkhouse office most evenings, and the sound of 2 voices doing the accounts had replaced the sound of one. Oak. A circuit preacher came through Colfax County in October, as he did every fall, and stayed 3 days at Holt's Ranch. Oak. On the 2nd day he performed 3 ceremonies. Oak. Beatrice stood beside Cassian in the clear mountain light, and exchanged vows in a voice that was steady as a level line. Cassian looked at her with the focused, complete attention he had previously reserved for the ridgeline, which everyone who knew him understood was the highest form of regard he possessed. Oak. Fletcher and Addie stood together in the shade of the porch. Addie's color was better than it had been in a year. The satchel she had carried 3,000 miles, as though her life depended on it, sat open on the table inside, its contents finally resting, its purpose finally finished. Fletcher held her hands like something irreplaceable, which she was. Oak. Holt Hargrove stood in front of Rosalind Fenn and looked at her without ceremony, without softness, and without apology, exactly as he'd looked at her in his kitchen the first night, except that this time she looked back with all her carefully constructed walls left deliberately open. Oak. She had come to the edge of the New Mexico territory running for her life. She had brought a war in a battered strongbox and a key worn on a cord around her neck. What she had not planned for, had not budgeted for in any of her careful calculations, was the particular gravity of a man who spoke in short sentences and meant every one of them. She said I do with full knowledge of what she was agreeing to, which was the only way Rosalind Fenn had ever agreed to anything in her life. The Sangre de Cristo Mountains held the last of the evening light long after the sun dropped below the western horizon, and when the dark finally came, it came gently, the way it does in country that has nothing left to hide. I keep thinking about that iron key Rosalind wore on a cord around her neck for 3,000 miles. Not the strongbox it opened, not the courtroom it eventually unlocked, just the key itself. The weight of it against her collarbone every single day while she ran, while she lied to a matchmaker in St. Louis, while she sat across the table from a man who could have turned her out into the desert and had every legal right to do so. She carried that key because her father had asked her to. And she carried it because she understood, even in her grief, that what was right and what was easy were two entirely different roads. That's the thing I can't stop sitting with. Edmund Fenn was a land agent with 30 years of quiet, honest work behind him. He could have looked the other way. Stroud's fraud was profitable, entrenched, protected by men with badges and court appointments. The safe thing, the reasonable thing, was to keep his head down and let it go. But he didn't. He spent months documenting what he saw, made copies, hid them carefully, and told his daughter to hold on to the key. He paid for that choice with his life, and because he made it anyway, 53 families got their land back. I think about that kind of moral clarity a lot. The kind that doesn't perform itself, doesn't announce itself, just quietly keeps the record straight even when the record is dangerous. Edmund never got to see what his documentation did. He never stood in Judge Rourke's courtroom, but his work was there, meticulous and damning, doing exactly what he'd intended it to do. That's what integrity actually looks like. Not the grand gesture, but the long, unglamorous practice of keeping your accounts honest when no one is checking. And then there's what Rosalind did with what she inherited from him. She didn't just survive, she thought. She figured out the bureau, the false names, the routing. She read the warrant the writer brought, and knew immediately it was fraudulent because she had studied who had signed it and what that signature meant. When Holt told her about Judge Rourke in Denver, she didn't ask him how he knew. She immediately began working out the logistics of getting the strongbox from Nashville without being intercepted. That kind of thinking, precise and forward-moving even under pressure, doesn't come from luck. It comes from paying attention over a long time. From treating knowledge as something worth accumulating even when you don't know yet what you'll need it for. Beatrice did the same thing in her own register. She learned to read the ridgeline. She asked Cassian what Stroud's men looked like, and then filed the answer exactly where it belonged. She didn't wait to be protected. She made herself useful to the protection. There's something in that I want to hold on to. The idea that intelligence isn't a fixed thing you either have or don't, but a practice of staying alert. Staying curious, staying one step ahead of your own fear. But what moves me most when I sit with this story is Addie, the smallest one. The one who arrived looking hollowed out, clutching a satchel like a shield, flinching at horses. She had been sick, she had been running. She had every reasonable justification for simply enduring, for letting her elder sisters carry the weight of what their father had left behind. Instead, she pressed the diary into Fletcher's hands before she descended into the root cellar, looked him in the eyes, and said, "Don't lose that." That's not a small thing. That's someone who had nothing left to give and gave it anyway. That's the kind of persistence that doesn't look like strength from the outside. It looks like a thin girl in a too large coat, holding on to what matters. But it is the realest kind of strength there is. Stroud had money, legal cover, hired guns, and a federal commissioner in his pocket. What he didn't have was a single person around him who kept their word. And in the end, that's what brought him down. Not force, record-keeping. Not luck, preparation. Not rescue. 3 sisters who refused to be separated from each other, or from the truth their father died to protect. I think about what we carry without knowing why. The keys we wear around our necks, the diaries we press into someone else's hands in the dark. I think most of us know, somewhere, what the right thing is. The question is only whether we're willing to carry it all the way to Denver.